Hello everyone, today we talk about 15th century warfare, which we haven't had much the chance of focusing on. This video is a bit more of an excursus that can touch, let's say, on some topics of medieval warfare and especially the medieval art of war in general, right? A bit of myth-busting, the allegedly rough and primitive development of medieval armies and tactics and armament and so on. That, I would say, it is still believed, right? The 15th century is an important key to these topics because it is in many ways the century of the medieval art of war that has been at least more popularized for in turn many reasons as well. They're mostly historiographical, the dominance of certain countries in the historiographical landscape when we look at the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, also for the sake of spectacularity, let's say, as far as the full plate armor is concerned, the Milanese, the Gothic forms. So when you think about a medieval knight, think very often, at least in Western culture, about the 15th century men-at-arms. And about very kind of specific context. Very often on Schwerpunkt, some novelists contacted me by saying, I'm writing a book about medieval warfare, and all the time this took place in either England or Burgundy, right, in the 15th century, and that's basically it, right? It's this idea that more or less the hot or the high point, let's say, that has been mostly interiorized, this kind of northwestern 15th century, very often stereotypically kind of gloomy reality, also with very specific architecture, northern Gothic, half-timbered houses, the obscurity, the tavern, the beer per se, and of course that is fascinating. And that I dedicated myself lots of videos to those times and places, and I will keep doing that because I think I've talked too few about them. But that I have this kind of more, in fact, this wider distribution of content that prevents, at least statistically, to cover it with a certain frequency. In any case, that's perfectly fine as long as, of course, people are interested in these topics. The broader point being, though, that within this context and within the type, again, of literary production and kind of also entertainment, movies, series, whatever, that has become kind of self-referential at a point. It has become a matter of not just the self-referentiality of a time or a place, which again is not a big deal. If that is done with some historical criterion, it's fine. Always bear in mind that there is never such a thing like watching a movie or playing a video game that tells you the real deal. I've met also many people that fundamentally convince themselves that watching historical movies has anything to do, but I mean the slightest, to do with acquiring any kind of historical notion, right? Also, especially from a military point of view. And what in fact is mostly wrong about this is the degree of self-referentiality of the myth, right? The idea that the Middle Ages becomes that myth, and even those who tell the history of those times and places in at least from a background that is meant at least to provide you with some minimal historical accuracy, tends still to play on the stereotype, right? You can easily see it on medievalistic channels. On YouTube, I will not make names, but let's say the greatest names in that direction are always that kind of Gothic fantasy. That's another very disturbing thing. The fantasy the dimension of that. How I had never understood any taste of fantasy. I detest any, at least popularization rendition of. Say, I've personally never read Tolkien books, right? So I can't judge them. But as far as the kind of the Lord of the Rings kind of popularized subcultural legacy. I think that has been one of the single most disastrously abhorrent, damage caused to properly the perception of the Middle Ages as such. The same goes. I mean, I even detest Star Wars. I literally can't get. I detest the fact that it is, of course, how it is used, not the thing in itself. They may even enjoy. I don't have anything specifically against the. Of course, I'm comparing very different products here, but the let's say that kind of popular cheering hype around emotions kind of let out wildly like imbecile children, fundamentally, especially in adults, is something that on a mass scale I cannot tolerate, right? And this is not because also I'm a historian. It's something I've always had as far as I can remember, to say I feel ashamed for them, right? I feel ashamed for the complacency and self-indulgency that people have whenever it comes to be part of a group that requires minimal or substandard intelligence to be part of. That's something I properly can't take, right? So if I am watching which I never do, but clips circulate, a Netflix series about, I don't know, it could be things like Outlaw King, right? That series that are popularized even by those voices and medievalistic, allegedly, supposedly competent channels on YouTube. Oh my God, this is so accurate. Whatever. Why? Because there are a bunch of people who wear, at least in part, some kind of historical clothing or armor. And what about the entire rest, including the fact that of course, battles are some of the most ridiculous thing that I've ever seen, properly in a logical sense. This is not military history. Of course, military history is logic and reality. And we know very well, historiographically speaking, that things are not, of course, as any single movie has dreamt to represent. And this goes to, of course, whenever you enter these groups, these movements, this phenomenon, I don't know how to say, and this mixes heavily also with reenactment, even with humanism, and so on. You would expect, I don't know, that there is something there, by at least some kind of scientific standard. There isn't, right? If I start, of course I understand people want to make money easily and playing on the stereotype and playing on ignorance, which is easy because you just don't have to learn anything, right? And so providing this idea that, I don't know, you say a bunch of things of how, the physics of a sword works, and then the person from the other side, or very often, too sadly, even yourself, thinks that this has anything to do with being even remotely competent with any degree of military historical expertise, tactically or strategically, is an insult, again, to the dignity of the average human intelligence. But this has become apparently the standard. And while in the tenths of the 2000s we've witnessed kind of an increase of the kind of, I want historical accuracy phenomenon, that is essentially a reaction to the previous decade, to our generations, as we were playing video games like the Total War series or other, strategic games and so on, and that, were in turn, even in the previous decades, the kids that didn't have video games and that just looked at things like medieval warfare watching movies, right, like Braveheart or I don't know, and we got hyped just at the concept of having, for the first time, the means that today's kids don't even care to have, like in terms even again of a video game, like one of the Total War series, is understandable. Except again, the eventual kind of degree of satisfaction was pretty low because the means are limited, and the obvious understanding for anyone who got to that point that you have at least to study medieval history to understand anything to a significant degree. I mean, studying medieval history seriously, not clicking I like or subscribing to whatever medievalistic or medieval, just hopefully historical content, but actually studying, which doesn't mean even buying or having a lot of books, but actually studying them as you would do for a living, for a professional work, which is a completely different thing from reading them, right? Don't think that reading per se saves your soul, right? It doesn't, right? It's a minimal effort compared to what it takes to spend a lifetime researching, and especially in this sense, trying to reconstruct how, things literally work, in this case on the battlefield, is a completely different story. So it seems to me instead that in the 20s of the 2000s, we have something different. We have essentially the collapse of that. We have people of my generation now are significantly even more than grown-ups, and that are in work, have a career, whatever. They are in the heat of making children, having a family, and so that hype has somehow disappeared, and or at least maybe burning under the ashes. But we don't have all the time we would like to, unless, like me, you pick the unfortunate chance of becoming like in the sense of polemologist by profession, and focusing on these things. In my case, also in a relatively accidental way, but we can talk about that on another occasion. And the new generations that we're pouring in are just look at any kind of ads today, any kind of movies. Like before, I don't know, in the early 2000s, there were movies worth of this name, right? Those represented kind of the degree of an artistic, moral, scientific standard that now has completely collapsed. You have just a bunch of, comic book kind of childish version of say superheroes that are meant to be like dumb kids that do dumb things with references to Fourth Estate subculture that are supposed to just leave all the emotions out. This kind of socialistic, racialistic indoctrination of, I don't know, you can think to evade from your avatar, to decide to be a man instead of a woman, and all this bullshit, and mental disorders, and actual autoimmune diseases, because that's where it gets down to. And so the entire concept of even, requiring anything historical and seriously historical, the only historical stuff that circulates now is essentially the meme is always the Nazi, right? Whether, I don't know, the history of, the Nazis, look at the Eastern Front, how it really was. And again, it's even in those kind of things is, reduced to, of course, there is nothing in terms of strategic education or whatever. It's just a bunch of video games, first-person shooter, movie-made replicas that are supposed just even to make people grow dumber regarding, again, the idea that the single guy goes out there and do things, and that's the single most important thing you should think about. It's all aestheticism, it's all emotionalism, it's all... there is no trace of history, because those who make those productions do not have any historical interest. I mean, being obsessed with the Nazis, or having played video games on World War I, the Second, whatever, and just wanting to see, again, knowing the world allegedly through these nationalistic memes, is actually the indicator of a very poor education. It really talks about, sometimes, abusive households. I mean, especially RPG games, and for that matter, it does turn out that anime, whatever, all this, the kind of direction derives very often from an abuse-based alienation as individuals, right? Many mass shooters are in those things, for example. You would think to be, again, in kind of the hardcore far right wing, not in time. I mean, it overlaps sometimes. Actually, it's pretty common. I see it even among some of my followers, unfortunately, as I receive notifications when people subscribe on Twitter and so on, and you realize that they subscribe only to certain ethno-racialistic content, that they cannot care less about the civilizational quality of history. They fundamentally live in a sort of paranoid, underdeveloped, tribalistic, safe space that makes them delude themselves that is enough to make a sort of civilizational step forward, and just grows themselves weaker and incapable, and they are the best expression of that kind of civilizational collapse in the first place, that they are causing because they're too weak, right? At least during World War II, communists, Nazis, fascists had the guts to get themselves killed at some level that is respectable. In today's world, we just have, again, a generation of alienated kids. Most of this stemmed from the same YouTube back in the day. If you go still on any World War II video, you will find under it people that are overtly claiming to be Nazist, white supremacist, and or the same thing, but in the post-Soviet source, that is to say, as I always say, nationalism and socialism are literally the same identical thing, because you cannot have one without the other. It's always about the substandardization of the individual, of some kind of group, right? It can be a nation or a class, it doesn't matter. They're always fourth estaters without a satisfactory existence. And so the entire point of having a quality product that can be mass consumed to elevate the individual to higher dignified standards for the first time in their life, in many cases, is practically out of the equation, right? You would think that the more we went on, the more we could see, I don't know, an improved version of whatever the great, say, movie tradition about, I don't know, historical, in fact, stories could be about. There is none of this. There is a chipification, there is a fragmentation, there is also an incredible lack of originality, right? The last decade, I would say, it's been the decade of remakes most, right? Hoping that just, it's not that they ran out of option, it's that the entire mechanism to which they produce this stuff is incredibly short-term based, and that is an indicator of lack of civilizational compass, because a civilization knows what to do always, from here to eternity, right? And it just is meant to improve. This mentality has completely collapsed, right? We reached the peak of it, at least as far as we grew. It doesn't matter how much losing in the meanwhile traditional values, but let's say between the 90s and the early 2000s, we had still deeply ingrained the concept of, maintaining a stable order based on authority, on reason, on discipline, and everybody had to find their own way to build that up. Nowadays, there is a fatigue, there is a weakness, there is a recession, there is an involution, right? And this means that there isn't also, well, I will not digress further, but you would say, why does this have to do with the 15th century? Well, it has to do with the 15th century because, again, most of what still remains portrayed about the Middle Ages revolves around that stereotype, revolves around that kind of RPG kind of mentality of roles that you have seen thinking about the Middle Ages. There is no political depth to it, there is no actual social depth to it, there's no, of course, no military depth to it, except a bunch, again, of prejudices and deep scientific misunderstandings, like even just, again, playing Mount and Blade is not like, I don't know, a simulation experience. And there are people who get angry and somehow defensive about even hearing these things, because they believe that indoctrinating themselves to that kind of, it's aestheticism at the end of the day. It's not even about game mechanics, that they don't understand it. That's why they skip the concept that it could be wrong, right? It's like those people that, I don't know, think that if they fakely and weakly beat each other with Viking armor, they will ever find out how Vikings used their weapons. It cannot be known, right? Because you don't have a Viking battlefield to test that, and you don't have the mentality of a Viking, you don't have the entire political, social, or material background of a Viking. And no, trying to make replicas pass for real stuff and fooling undereducated people into thinking that that's actual competence is not real, right? There are lots of, again, trash. There is some kind of further medieval, this often happens also in post-socialist countries. This is kind of revival that warriorism is the way, right? That warriorism equates emotionalism, equates like I'm just a a Fort Estater suburban thug that goes out beating people, except nobody ever told that person that a medieval army was a civilization of orderly, cold, authoritative, rational, collectively disciplined war machine that slaughtered warriors as a living, and our civilization is founded over the corpses of stupid warriors that could not achieve more power than beyond themselves. And this is the exact entire imperial traditional doctrine of power, in fact, based on the fact that the entire point of tradition is to dominate over the whole world, and a stinky tribe that cannot go beyond a few tens of kilometers is a culturally underdeveloped people that effectively cannot afford to become anything more than itself until it does, and it doesn't look like a tribe anymore. And this is why today we have so many nationalists and socialists, because their entire point is to be reduced to that weaker individual incapacity that cannot afford to rule over the world, right? And there's the same reason why these countries are, of course, phobically paranoid about, and they have to entrench ever more into themselves, because exactly the concept is you're incapable, so instead of going past that, you dig your own grave even further to be ever weaker and smaller and insignificant. And that's how, again, we bank it as a civilization over the relics of these peoples whose name we don't even know, because objectively, who the hell cares about who gets wiped out? This is the entire point of civilization, and this is the most hated concept that, in fact, the wide majority, because in my personal experience, this is what it's gotten down to in Himaism, in reenactment, in this world kind of also partially mentally ill, kind of RPG fantasy obsessed reality, cannot afford to eliminate from themselves, because their manifestation is the confirmation of their own inferiority, and they must alienate themselves in turn to keep pretending the entire thing to be worth it, right? And that's why there is no minimal military historical competence except the fake one that they sell to even less educated and incapable people than they are personally. And that's the only space in which this, in fact, is ever kind of even taken in consideration. Now, the 15th century is important also for another aspect that is more historiographical, and this is not to say that even scholars are much beyond kind of this state of, narcissistic, again, whatever I do, it must be the final one. It must be, it's so elevated just because I have a piece of paper saying that I'm a doctor, whatever, and that I am a PhD, and I don't say these things because I expose continuously the hardships of research, which are the only ones that matter. The only thing that matters in the history of mankind is how much blood you spit, how much tears you sweat. That's the exclusive matter of civilization. There is no other human value except in pain and suffering, because without that you cannot achieve anything. You cannot improve yourself, you cannot transfigure, and you cannot go anywhere, right? We are all within that journey. I mean, there are people who legitimately, let's say, step up at some point. They wake up, they realize it's all BS. I managed to find somewhere on the internet even the confessions of repented Himaists that, of course, are not flattering the kind of also incredibly fanatical, doctrinal, hysterical conflictualism that emerges between their schools, because, again, it's a matter of name, money, and how much you don't want to feel individually challenged as a failure of a person. And that's unfortunately where this kind of, we know perfectly well what, again, non-imperial standards really mean in practice. We have studied underdeveloped cultures. We know how these things work in our society's substratum. We know we can document sadly pretty well the level of social disease and parasitism that is associated with these levels of incapacity. But the 15th century has also been equivocated on the wake of the dreaded delusion of the military revolution that has plagued us now for a consistent amount of decades, and that fundamentally that has been debunked actually by his own founder, right? And that has, of course, not abandoned the nomenclature. Let's put it in this way: has not fully kind of eliminated his. Of course, part of his work that was actually good. So we don't have to be. We always have to be thankful for and being able to, first of all, separating wheat from the chaff and knowing how to recognize the former, so that we can go on. Even true failures, right? Because failures, again, failure is the sap for hopefully something more, at least if you put any effort into the matter. However, the problem with the 15th century, this concept that in spite of the fact that naturally we see things like properly the passage from, it's an approximation even here, between medieval warfare and at least the Renaissance and the modern age, modern warfare. I am greatly opposed ideologically to the concept that there was a modern era of some sort. Doesn't matter per se. There is objectively a level of subtle development and civilizational advancement that does bring, for the first time, a consistent amount of troops to be trained collectively as such, right? So not just like the conglomeration of smaller elements that surely were, in this sense, brought on the battlefields in the previous centuries, still without important collective effectiveness, and much of that, and I study especially that in the last, basically, expression of the great full medieval civilization, so before, of course, the late Middle Ages. While, again, the idea of the military revolution has brought, without any doubt, this kind of to this delusion for which the idea that there is a linear development in infantry power and fundamentally unequally political blossoming of individual liberties. I've explained countless times how this is not true. The ancien regime was properly founded in its most crystallized order exactly in this moment, right? The point, though, is that this did correspond, because politics and society are malleable in this regard, to a reinforcement of a statal order, right? Essentially, the realization that in front of the crisis, the cooperation, right, of the, say, of a given community towards a common goal, in some cases makes in fact the difference between life and death, and that there is effectively not enough space for the people to move again, because during the 14th and 15th century the peasantry was brutally brought down after the failed attempt, because of course they didn't have the tools to be able to actually, of course, to carry out a revolution was not possible in the first place, but even to earn their place as a fourth estate representatively in the institutions, which instead they did have at a point the opportunity of doing, but again they were uncoordinated. And the same triumph of the state here, of the highest nobility, of the order that in fact is affirmed prepotently at this point, is sanctioned also by the capacity of this elite to mobilize now these masses of de facto proletarians. This is how moments of great crisis, I don't know, you find it even after a crisis of the Hellenic polis when the Macedons take over war the Macedonian Sarisopheroi. They're just basically like the Marian legionnaires. They're fort assidators that are paid by major warlords or monarchs that are able to found incredibly powerful empires that had a dramatic civilizational consequence, and that are also, in fact, remembered for being the single most military advanced of their era. And in many ways, this occurs also in the 15th century, with an important rise of infantry that naturally starts from not much of a monarchic or princely example, but that actually would be coupled with it in a way or another. We're talking about the Swiss, naturally. I made videos about them, about their warfare, their armies, and we'll keep discussing them, but it's first of all obvious that the confederal government was still controlled by an aristocracy. These were not just mere mountaineer communities that had just this kind of freeborn spirit that made it all, right? You know, the most advanced parts of Switzerland were naturally the richest, the most urbanized, the ones that could field more troops to keep them better, and all this stuff. This army essentially succeeded in, as I was saying before, achieving this collective level of training that had never quite been seen before in the same way, and or this is highly debatable, because we will see it in medieval warfare. There had already been armies capable of fielding not just single blocks of thousands of drilled infantry that was able to advance, to oppose themselves to cavalry by a degree. The important is that the Swiss are become decisive in this regard. Those experiments had been carried out among some of the most advanced armies of the previous centuries. They worked well, and they are understudied, and I specialize specifically in them. And probably you will read at some point something from me, because I'm publishing, now a significant amount of stuff. But in fact, if you compare also the Swiss numbers, you realize that there are often just several thousand soldiers. They're hardly more than that, and even just Renaissance warfare is not substantially much larger than, say, 14th century warfare, for example, especially in the beginning, in the first half. Naturally, politics is different, society is different. There is no doubt that by the early modern age, there are some powers that can invest a dramatic amount of resources now and concentrating them exactly to achieve those collective standards that become really standard, because all the monarchs of Europe copy the Swiss model as far as the infantry, and also surpass it, because the Swiss had technically just infantry, and other countries could afford large numbers of course, the traditional heavy cavalry, much larger artillery parks. The Swiss had to import it from other countries or loot them after, their victories. Naturally, everything is relative to the context. So also, the Swiss achievements are remarkable. But that's again, you search on YouTube for those videos. The Swiss, the greatest soldiers that ever existed in the Middle Ages. Question mark. This is the level of sensationalistic popularization that doesn't help anyone comparatively explaining what was happening in Europe in that given moment, right? You can't praise the Swiss as much as I did without putting out this kind of disgusting firework rhetoric that really, again, teaches people to be dumb. It's not a service to history. It's not a service. I realize that there are already many dumb kids that don't even know that the Swiss existed or what they did at that time, but that's the chance for you to be top, and you're just like a cartoonish kind of clickbait 10 minutes long thing that doesn't quite, or even if it's longer sometimes, doesn't quite nail the point precisely of why that is important comparatively in the art of war. There is good content out there, don't get me wrong. I'm not just by default critical, anything is out there, but the tendency is that, right? And the interesting aspect of that, as I was saying, is that the self-referentiality of it, because you may have that laid out, and then you would expect there are all the other armies of 15th century Europe covered, right? No, there aren't. There are just the ones that have been popularized by a certain type of second grade kind of historiography, that mostly the disclosing one that has sold a lot in the last decades, that again makes a synthesis of, say, the art of war in a 200 pages book. And of course it doesn't explain fundamentally anything, it's mostly biased, it just checks some aspects, especially the ones of the military revolution, for example, praising, I don't know, the Hussite tactics, which is another of those topics that, again, I covered in detail, and the more I studied, the more I realized how hyper-pumped and kind of, from a strictly military point of view, it really was, especially considering that you will hear about the Hussites everywhere, but you will not hear about many other armies in Europe that have never actually been even properly popularized, or that were just the standard, which was normally in Europe already a dramatically more advanced standard than that. And that instead doesn't look as cool as, this meme. That's what eventually gets down to, right? Not even trying to pretend, of course, to make people understand what politically or religiously Hussitism literally did, because that's also really, again, it would be more useful in the first place, or, for example, stressing the importance of the moral legacy of the Hussites. It doesn't matter whether it was ideological fanaticism, but it was very important, for example, for fueling the Protestant Reformation, setting the seed of revolt, of war, even in, for example, in Germany, where many emigrated, in the following century, there would have been the Peasants' War, that was deeply intertwined with the Reformation and beyond, right? So, reading at things, first of all, from a moral point of view, as war as a moral clash, right, between two sides that reciprocally influence each other, but also in the technique, right, in the fact that Hussite tactics have been successful, no doubt, but that, again, are still part, for example, of a 15th century that, together with the second half of the 14th century, as late Middle Ages, are not a moment of kind of escalatory military development as it's been portrayed to us. Just to make an example, like, the military revolution has sensationalized anything that was teleologically, because of the myth of modernity and infantry as the arm of the future, again, any kind of infantry victory. Doesn't matter whether this is incredibly modest, looking at the general picture, and it's kind of normal also that at some point an infantry could defeat cavalry, because the dominance of cavalry, the prodrome, the premise of this is just actually a couple of centuries. Right, the decisiveness, at least the unchallenged one, on Western European battlefield, and before it was a prevalence, but never quite like, infantry had been discarded as being able to win a battle. So there's all a kind of, though that was the system of the terrible aristocrats who were evil and oppressive, and the dark view of the Middle Ages that still remains, even in those, in the representation of the debunkers nowadays. That's what I criticize as well, as I said before. And again, pretending that the single most important thing that ever happened, militarily speaking, occurred in this late medieval and early modern age, and then, well, in the second modern age, there starts because the military revolution focus stopped to the mid 17th century. Never mind, the mid 17th century is the moment in which there was the greatest boom of the modern age, with the creation of the statal armies by the Sun King that were by scale enormous, right? So if what happened before was essentially a century long, essentially a half millennium long, especially if you take the notion that also gunpowder changed everything, but it took literally 500 years before firearms from the battlefield became fundamentally the most important arm. And then you have literally the boom happening in a few generations in the immediately following period, but nobody ever said, that was a military revolution, right? At least for maybe just desperate scholars that want to make their own firework, hoping to sell more, like, particle physicists or this kind of, other foolish enterprises that must perpetuate the lie in front of an ignorant audience, right? So you have a magnitude, scholar overshadowing, boom that occurs literally after this kind of bradypic development, and the first one becomes the military revolution. And what happened later? Well, never mind about that, because we don't like in the same way we decided to make a mythology about. And then now everyone has to deal with that period, has to deal with this thing of the military revolution that I, by method, wouldn't even properly use as a term, right? I would explain my own way, and just making people coming back on Earth, right? So the 15th century, of course, is not only viewed like that. I guess that there is enough information out there also at a popular level to YouTube videos and so on to realize that yes, the military interest toward the 15th century is not either just one of these two aspects, right? Not the kind of battle of the nation, socially diseased, individually complexed individual who has to smash himself bones, dressed up in a full plate armor, thinking that that's a goal in life, because the 15th century has shiny armor, literally it. Or again, the hysterical fanatic that followed Parker's firework slogan of military revolution and all this other amenities. There is also a legitimate interest towards the art of war of that era. Like the kid that arrives legitimately interested in 15th century warfare and says, where do I begin with this, right? And wants to simply dimension, because that's also where it gets down to. You can understand this line, more or less, this trail of events, of battles, of armies, of nationalities, but then how do they compare to each other, right? There is much to learn, of course, from a comparative study of with the same modern age, with Renaissance warfare. I don't know how many people actually come from that kind of reverse mechanism chronologically, but I've seen even modernists that eventually started approaching like more 15th century history, becoming medievalists, right, crossing, entering the portal, de facto from the other side. And my interest in the 15th century was relatively limited, I must confess, over time, because, historiographically speaking, at least the way it is researched and studied and whatever is not, in my opinion, it's not been the best, not just because of the aforementioned historiographical problems, but because it's very, very easy to, and this is another problem of historiography in general, to just pick an archive source, say making a list of the troops that existed in a given garrison somewhere in Europe, because by the 15th century we have more than that, and then writing a paper on it. And of course, maybe doing it for the rest of your life, but never caring about the art of war per se. That's another huge problem that actually is very, as a continental European, I see this better than the Anglosphere. I know most of my audience is American, first of all, but then also like from Britain and the lands of the Commonwealth, if you want. I have people that mostly they haven't properly grown up in. Of course, most people haven't properly even studied these things in general, even here. But say that there is a completely different approach that we have in the countries that somehow dominated this aspect, like France, Germany, Italy, and so on, all with their own way, right? There are different national academic traditions. We have here definitely the best scholars in the world regarding humanistic faculties and so on. There's no doubt about this, right? Unfortunately, again, the Anglosphere has gone down. Right? And I say that because I've grown myself too also with that share of kind of Anglo-Saxon influence, given that the so-called new military history, which is also kind of like mostly again, something I would criticize per se, because it never got down to what it should have really done, and the problems are much more serious behind that than you think. But at least was the only one that for a long time wrote about these things. Now, on the continent, we got too lazy because part it was because it was the World War II, and so the fact that we lost, we had problems with the war, with of course with nationalism, with this idea that whoever studied military history was a sort of Nazi-fascist or something like that. And so we have arrived to a point in world history in which I think these topics are going to stagnate because, as I said before, I think the last golden section of, kind of Western civilization has already not just been born, but, now we are almost old, and after that I don't see kind of much of another, I don't know, there's an energy and interest, because these topics are, as far as I know, being abandoned, as far as I know, also in Britain, that for a long time detained also together with the US, this kind of, palm of military historical interest now is seemingly beginning to discriminate against people who want to make PhDs in this, in fact, polymological field. Lots of terrifying things are happening all over the world, and there is no light at the end of the tunnel, if not a train, if that's what the joke goes. And the responsibility for maintaining at least some standards, being able to make this knowledge survive, for the next generation to say, wait a minute, this thing existed, these books were written, this perspective had already been analyzed. It may seem banal as a concept, but I think it's quite important, right? I would like to possibly eliminate all of the major political kind of bias that existed in the last 20 years against, let's say, in the way it worked, not even the political one, but let's say the historical one against warfare, and or maybe trying to resume warfare but not having the palest idea of how to do it, and so becoming as dangerous as this kind of broader ignorance and or prejudices and whatever, and continuing on that kind of still hopeful feeling that had at least initially sprang from the possibility of evaluating military history more seriously, more comprehensively, more systematically, more diachronically, more comparatively, right? There are great authors like Nicole, right? Sometimes, I don't like what he writes. He's not competent or expert in everything, but it's one of those great last figures of people that studied a lot of things at a time. They looked into, say, documentary sources as archaeology, etc., and set at least, provided us with large amounts of bases that can be employed for writing other things. And naturally, the greatest basis of all are the actual sources that you have to find out yourself, by yourself, and without studying the art of war, which again has nothing to do with reading a lot of books. It's nothing to do with studying arms and armor, dressing yourself up with that, or going to archives and pretending to have found the Grail, without even having even studied a campaign or a battle per se from all the sources available, which takes a considerable amount of time, and also having undergone a significant amount of review, right, of peer review, which really works, at least as a system, is the best one that we have in absolute terms, and that should be the first standard you should look for. So not wishful thinking, nor even just, I don't know, something that's been supervised by your tutor when you're doing a bachelor thesis or a degree thesis. It must be a very serious thing. So the 15th century is also one of those moments in which of transition. All centuries really are, but that we have at least began to depict as such, because as far as the emergence of a more compact modern statual dimension, at least, very often, in fact, connected with the needs of warfare, because these were the greatest expenses that states had at the time, began to produce also a different type of organization that required more theory, or at least that started presenting theory, of course, or that started to present theory in a more consistent way. We have, for the first time, a significant number of men-at-arms really writing on the topic of war in a theoretical sense. Say manuals had always existed, there had always been a classical tradition, but the level of development of the art of war up to that point had objectively not rendered it necessary to just have a book on which to simply rely on, that would have to explain literally what war was and what you feel about it, how you have to command the men, how you have to organize the supplies, and this kind of thing. So it's very distant still from anything comprehensively theoretical. The only true theory of the art of war that has, with a positive applicational benefit, let's say, remains, because nothing also civilizationally was ever created, added to it afterwards. Of course, the Von Kriege of Karl von Clausewitz, right from the Renaissance. However, you start having figures like Machiavelli, then you have the other link with von Clausewitz is fundamentally Montecuccoli, and you have this tradition properly that has affirmed itself, and that, of course, mirrored the debate, the kind of interest, the ambitions also of the establishment, that was still a military one. It was essentially a military aristocracy, to perfect the way that they would fight, right? And so there are some aspects about this that are actually much more similar to what happened before and would continue happening afterwards, conceiving war as a sort of an aristocratic sport of some sort. Albeit, this is also a picture which we receive from the terms in which war was, described, rather than what war really was already at the time. In fact, in the 15th century, there's a bit this kind of apparently individualistic ethos still making up for a lot of the shrinking that medieval armies had undergone in the previous centuries. This is an aspect which normally is not so powerfully understood. I mean, in historiography, the concept that there was a major crisis in the mid-14th century, this affected dramatically the same development of armies, right? That brought to a dramatic resizing, and that somehow slowed down the further implementation of actually even more advanced art of war, as it had been forming by the early 14th century, is not put forward, because the military revolution, first of all, would come out damaged from this concept, because there would have not been a linear development of infantry, in fact, which did not exist. It's a much more complex issue. It was actually a more sinusoidal trend. And it would also somehow challenge the military revolution bias regarding the achievements obtained by the early 14th century infantry-only armies of peasants and communes that were prized, again, modernistically, teleologically, technologistically, and whatever, to say, look, it's the moment in which the infantry rises, and ever since has always been rising. That's also false, because those same estates were carried out that very often in frontier areas, decentralized places, very often actually also underdeveloped ones in Europe, were also the ones that went under just in the following generations, with the crisis that broke their back demographically, economically, and that brought still the feudal aristocracy to take over once again. There is indeed a refeudalization of warfare by the say, starting with the mid 14th century crisis, until you can argue the same Swiss kind of I don't know how to call it. Reform sounds okay, let's say, and never. This is the thing you have to do. Never confuse the Swiss victories of the early 14th century, because they literally have nothing, and I can't stress this enough, nothing to do with what the Swiss started doing since the mid 15th century, which is a completely different thing. There is definitely a fil rouge that connects them, but it's a political one, it's a social one, it's not a military one per se. The Swiss in the early 14th century were not even among the strongest infantries that existed in that picture, and we, however, very often in those self-indulging stereotypes, we want to pretend that that was the case for some reason, even though, again, the actual mid-15th century reform stemmed from a pretty sound defeat of that same infantry, as a matter of fact, against dismounted men-at-arms that, prevailed just with their lances over the Swiss halberds and bows. And the reason it's not just because of that, naturally, but showing you how even morally superior to the feudal patriciate world was at that time. For not talking about the Flemish that gets basically ripped apart by Franco-Burgundian armies continuously throughout the entire 14th and 15th century, so that you can look at the Battle of Courtrai saying, wow, except, there were at best maybe 10,000, 15,000 infantry, so actually not even, there were armies that in Europe at the time that regularly employed 30,000, right, and against places that were pretty close that had other 30,000 from their side, a few hundred kilometers, not entire countries. We're talking sometimes even about city-states. So, as coalition armies, but still relying on a much more advanced combined arms system that we also have never seen against sole infantry armies, right? So, also this kind of prejudice we have against this cavalry of allegedly romantic, stubborn, and fundamentally stupid horsemen that went to charge everything they saw, and they couldn't accept or understand or tolerate that an infantry of commoners could win against them is a pure myth, right? You cannot read 14th and 15th century, not even the 100 Years' War, on that basis. There is even here, you are discounting the prejudice of pretending that the men-at-arms at some point was just some sort of, unchallenged, as if just cavalry for centuries without memory had just fought alone, without infantry, and the men-at-arms weren't the single most aware, military people in general in the world about the potential of the same infantry that they commanded, and that even in those victories of only infantry against cavalry were actually commanded by dismounted knights, by professionals of war, military advisors, and so on, because otherwise those could have not really had the even the upper hand, or knowing how to deploy, how to resist, what tactics to employ, and so on. So the most important thing about the 15th century is, and I say this even as an expert of medieval warfare, because this has not been done historiographically yet in a consistent way, assessing the increase naturally in infantry potential that surely happened throughout this time. It had been happening from quite a long time, right? 12th century or 13th century infantry were actually quite strong, right? The fact that cavalry was stronger than them doesn't mean that there hadn't been an improvement, or that we should simply see, some, again, crack in the established order in some peripheral, decentralized, and depressed areas of Europe where there also were weaker noblemen in the early 14th century as this huge deal. If it wasn't for the fact that, yes, we have 20 victories of that kind, and that surely things changed from a moral point of view. There was the idea that now a commoner could basically be part of an army that could defeat horsemen just with a single arm, and so there was a sort of inspiration to this, but also reading, as I've done, the sources of the time. There is a great marvel out of these events, but nobody says times have changed or this thing is going to lead anywhere, right? It was just seen as, these things can happen because everybody knows that infantry is dangerous by a degree. But the rest of Europe kept going with the normal preeminence of heavy cavalry in the most advanced places, and there is basically no exception to this. The 100 Years' War, that is also one of the most dramatically popularized conflicts from a military point of view, definitely displays conditions that are not the normal ones, meaning that especially the English habit of fighting dismounted, as we've seen, may have surely come as an habit tendentially from the wars of Scottish independence, where the English had to mostly just increase their firepower, which was not necessarily superior than the one of other countries, by the way, but at least to dismount, right, to cope with also the pikemen by a degree better, and we've seen this is something that continues happening normally in places where heavy cavalry exists, because heavy cavalry men at arms can always dismount and take on the enemy on foot. It was not a revolution, it was not strange, it was just the situation, and the fact that men at arms would dismount to receive heavy cavalry during the 100 Years' War, mostly from the English side, was mostly like in the most famous battles of the era, Crécy, Poitiers, and Azincourt, necessity dictated just by the obvious momentary inferiority of the English in terms of actual strength. I mean, numerically speaking, first of all, and so the necessity of abandoning the normal practice of essentially clashing battle lines of mounted men at arms against each other to try to exploit the advantages of the defensive, with all the limitations that this also entailed. It's a desperate move, because in all those battles the English were not definitely in a florid strategic or tactical situation, and their success must be measured in that capacity to come out of that alive. But if they had more balanced odds, they would have taken on the French mounted, as they were all basically mounted men at arms with the horses left somewhere else that would normally fight mounted in open field, right? From this also a mythology occurred. Today we talk about the 15th century, so if you look at Azincourt, that is kind of the most famous in many ways regarding this kind of 100 Years' War. English tactical superiority, that there is no doubt is one of the single most successful ones, if not the greatest one, in terms of, as I say often, in condition of materials of symmetry in general, right? Because France and England were literally the same, and if you look at the numbers, you definitely do have their sequence that is the greatest in history. Like, you don't have any other army historically that achieves so much, such a consistent way, repeatedly against the odds in military history, in the entire military history. There's not a single people, a single army, single tactic that achieved that, right? This is quite important, but again, consider that it was a contingental tactic, that most of what you see there is not a normal habit, it's just what the strategic situation dictated, and so you can't quite even have, if you realize that the line was men at arms and that archers are light infantry, and so they are by definition non-decisive. Naturally, the combined armed tactics were as such, but the bulk of that was an aristocratic force in terms of strength. Right, and that there is hardly anything in terms of the development of, peasant armies or, commoners' armies. As I was saying before, the same goes for the Hussite wars. It's kind of a very, self-contained area of Europe where, things could happen in a certain way. That the Hussite armies were also less stereotypically composed than we think sometimes. They were fighting against. You have to consider the enemies, the terrain. How they employed their tactics, which is also very often not clear, and realize that, for example, in Central Europe there was, let's say, less artillery than the average. As I often say, Hussite Wagenburg had ventured out in the in some country in Western Europe and just engaged with some local armies, would have been just destroyed by artillery, likely even before an engagement, or at least without much possibility of resistance from an attack of the men at arms and the supporting troops, etc. Aside from the Swiss, again, of the mid-15th century, that create something completely different from what you have had during the Middle Ages. Again, an army that can composed solely by infantry that can take on and some of the most developed systems, such as the ones of the Burgundians, and winning consistently and repeatedly even on that occasion, is it, right? There would be a lot to say also about the Swiss victories there, because while you cannot deny the sequence, there is also the realization that all these armies were one step away from destruction, right? There was never like a tactical problem solver that nobody had ever thought about, and what the Swiss were doing in sending just their own divisions out there without any support, because literally were only infantry, and hoping just to catch the enemy unprepared with an asymmetric attack and so a speed to maintain cohesion, because that was the main point. There wasn't even a particularly advanced, refined fencing with the pike. It was just bringing that mass to a place where the enemy wouldn't know what to do about all of the sudden, because again, infantry had never achieved that speed so far unless breaking the formation, right? Things could go seriously wrong. It takes an enormous courage, determination, order, all things that the Swiss definitely proved. But the Swiss parabola was also to decline, as we've seen. Pike and shot warfare is, in fact, not just pikes, right? It takes the shot in the form. Naturally, I'm not saying that the Swiss didn't know cavalry or artillery, or at that point, arquebusiers were coming about, crossbow men and so on. It's just that they were so few, and banally Switzerland didn't, like just today, and that's why you have to appreciate it more than anything in her historical success. They didn't have any resource. They didn't have literally the ones for producing artillery, right? And they would mostly seize the Burgundian part in order to make up for that deficiency, but fundamentally also were surpassed, were at some point integrated paradoxically as this great confederal spirit of commoners integrated in the most monarchic country in Europe, France, because the French didn't want to arm their own peasants, and so they picked the Swiss that would come back home when the campaign was over. There was a fierce, rivalry with the Landsknechts as well, that were the imperial response to them, and I made a video about them. About the 15th century, we don't really hear much more in terms of actual advancement of infantry per se, right? At least in a specific sense. You have the Wars of the Roses that are naturally a pivotal moment in English history, and that, however, were by the political will of the participants quite contained engagements that didn't destroy the country, for example. They were, of course, dynastically based. It was about also the fact of fighting on foot largely. I made a video about the tactics of the Wars of the Roses, was designed to there were many considerations in terms of command morale, and we'll see partly these ones now. It mostly was the idea that you had to knock out the person in front of you, because if you did that, problem solving was worth risking your life for, because you would simply seize dynastically the throne and or many other possessions. And so that political goal made the military instrument as such. Then by the 15th century, mostly here the Reconquista, that doesn't see a dramatic use of infantry, at least that it's not really remembered. Aren't great infantry victories and or development. There's a lot of usually the cavalry warfare that remains decisive, artillery, the Great Siege of Granada. Right, at best the only infantry development you see is also ambiguously so in battles like Nicopolis and Varna in 1396, 1444. Where the Ottomans, however, use a comprehensive tactics that includes cavalry, infantry, also firearms, and it's not really a matter. It's been interpreted too as the center with sharp stakes and an infantry that would never get as heavy as the Western one that had to stop at least the unstoppable Western cavalry charge that, however, could be weakened to the point of collapse by making the wings coming back after heavy open for letting it pass through. And so that was also quite a risk, and unironically the Ottomans would never develop a very strong infantry like the Westerners, so you can't even see it teleologically as it's just, look here, it's not even about the infantry development, it's just saying, look, cavalry gets ripped apart in this engagement. And it is true, there is no doubt that there is all kind of an appreciation of the fact that cavalry was becoming ever more costly, ever heavier. We talk about 15th century war horses. There is a moment of greater, even properly the doctrine, even the array of cavalry changes accordingly. There is ever more specialized cavalry, first of all, to support the heavier lanks. And this is because literally the heavy cavalry becomes dramatically heavier, full plate armor for horse and rider, etc. And for the rest, that's basically it, right? The only other chapter, the 15th century, normally you hear is the Italian condottieri, which are depicted as the anachronistic, still kind of romantic, say medieval cavalry that eventually gets wiped out by during the Italian wars by the more steadily, kind of partially also infantry advanced Spanish and French armies. And that's also a reductive statement, because indeed, if you look at the Venetian condotta, integrated actually a very, a large amount of tactical combination in its doctrine. It was the most advanced army in Europe, together with the Burgundian one, before the latter got defeated by the Swiss list. And in all this, you have to appreciate whichever power and what their strategic goals were, on the base of also what they could afford politically and socially, right? I don't know, for example, the Italians, original states didn't have, that were normally kind of more industry-oriented. They had lots of a contained population and mostly dedicated to manufacturers, things like this. They were not as big as, let's say, the entire confederal, say, Swiss confederal mountaineers population could go at war repeatedly, just because mostly they would leave it even with less and with war, right? So these dynamics affect deeply the way eventually this countries fought, aside from their actual tactics, right? How much they went at war, what were their political goals. And we often underestimate, in the sense, how still by the end of the Middle Ages, great part of Northern Europe were somehow still backwards, right? How still during the early modern age in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, you still have almost a medieval picture still that had, of course, partially changed, especially with the introduction of firearms by a scale, but that even in the firearms, you have to appreciate the degree of, and not just thinking that this was sort of firearms appear, everything changes. It didn't happen. Like firearms, also as far as not just artillery, that becomes really a must by the 20s of the 15th century in Western Europe. By the 70s, the 80s, especially in countries like Italy, you have the increase of firearms, handguns specifically, like among infantry, a consistent degree, up to 1/3 of the total infantry numbers, which is a consistent one. There is another dynamic that has impacted the way we look at 15th century warfare in terms of perhaps infantry increased a little bit in importance, and it's the increased degree of fortification. After the mid-14th century crisis, the population, the economical resources of the continent had shrank dramatically, and this naturally had brought less people with more space, right? Which, together with the instability that had followed, etc., brought to an incredible degree of refortification, together with the refeudalization of warfare. It's obvious in this regard that if you have larger armies like the one of the 13th to 14th century, would easily overcome fortifications without even fighting by a degree, just that the resistance would melt away just during the advance. If you have more contained armies, in which also infantry has significantly declined from the previous period, so that you have mostly men-at-arms that you surely can dismount, but also need some degree of support, etc. After all, even little fortification and barrier, whatever, the capacities of which have dramatically increased also over time, because in parallel to this crisis, paradoxically, as we've seen, there is a higher degree of centralization, and so there is a greater fortification of cities, of properly some in this smaller spaces, because great territorial polities had also shrunk in the process, so they weren't much just floating over large parts of the world that was supporting them, but now they had to restart from a smaller area that naturally had also more defensive needs accordingly. Having fortified even with some pretty large, long fortifications in the countryside, whatever, and all this tended to slow down the mobility of the armies, the necessity of dismounting, rendering properly less likely and advantageous and relevant the great frontal charge between thousands of mounted men-at-arms in the older style. Which means that also you need means to surpass the state of things. Surely firearms probably increased dramatically, probably in an artillery direction in this period because of this phenomenon. Just think if the crisis had not happened, if armies had remained big, of 30,000 men, at least in the truly more advanced areas, say southwestern Europe, and say firearms would have developed in a much more open field oriented kind of direction as well. And who knows what warfare would have gotten out. It actually would have been a gradual development, not particularly different from the one happened, but still, right? The prevalent missile fire is provided by crossbows at this point, by also longbows, as you know, and non-gunpowder artillery. Right, gradually in the 15th century, the ratio brings to the shift in favor of guns, right, and that naturally is mostly a siege thing. On the battlefields, you don't really have too much, effect brought by firearms, but they're used, right, in concert with other pieces. And especially towards the mid-15th century, we really realized that guns on the battlefield have become something really, really important, right? That is beginning to play like a fully developed arm on its own, right? So the process is slow. We've seen some battles in which, for example, by the 60s or 15th century, have mobile guns being used also in consistent numbers. Made a video about the Battle of Molinella, for example, that at least presents with some of it's a large engagement with a consistent amount of guns in that regard. Always consider that we rely often on the larger battles as indicators of how, of course, certain weapons even were used, because for more a smaller engagement we are not dramatically documented in the first place. It's a myth that battles were kind of rarely pitched, right? This is truer probably by the 15th century than for the previous ones. You definitely have smaller armies fighting, as we have seen before, compared to the previous centuries. And this is also an evolution fundamentally. So even there is a reason why sometimes infantry has been also considered to be probably stronger than it was at this point, because smaller armies also require are more compact, better armed, better equipped. So if you have to field, 1,000 men in that sense, comparatively to the effort you could make for 10,000, you would equip them better, right? Depending on what they have to do. Naturally, the 15th century is definitely the century in which more armor is used on the battlefield, historically, ever, right? And you often see these pictures from the 100 Years' War in the illuminated manuscripts, etc., with, basically even, commoners equipped with plate armor, swords. We know they were affordable, right? And this derived from the fact that there was somebody that could, however, still pay for them, right? So because most of them were paid and they would equip themselves, and there is still a degree of distribution of equipment that existed since the time of the war bands of the migration era. It was not invented with the modern state, right? That had the military organization was the first centralized thing to be managed just by the foe, and the outcome was particularly evident already from quite a long time. Just sometimes we don't have the documentary evidence, like bureaucratically. That's why the 15th century is easy to document, and so people can start just writing stuff from much smaller things. So perspectively, you have something like, I study the entire picture. I don't study the entire picture anymore, of course. Not only that, but I also, regarding what I can study compared to before, I can study much smaller details. And so it's obvious that there would be a sort of historiographical exaltation for the ease for which you can write about the 15th century, but this doesn't mean that it was more important than what happened before, right? You can at best argue that warfare became more costly because of firearms, guns, that put on a logistical strain that also was made up an important part of why states needed a more centralized system to properly produce this stuff at least with a degree of public control. Other than that, however, most warfare remained pretty much medieval in nature, in that kind of more fragmented type of engagement that actually had always and would always remain, but that the Middle Ages wasn't even particularly, different from other periods like. This goes in parallel with other issues. Naturally, an increased control of the armies corresponds, and I made videos about this, to for example, the increase in discipline of groups of fighters, and also just in the capacity of territorial control, right? Also, the civilian groups that were very involved in warfare were at this point called much more directly to contribute to building. From the mid-14th century, start having properly permanent forces in the form of at least mercenaries that were not disbanded after the season, and that would be in fact billeted somewhere, and because barracks were not properly the current practice, they would develop later. There weren't military academies at this point either, right? So everything was very, very contingental. It was just how warfare had always been, at least in medieval times, and the main problem was to keep this man satisfied now with an adequate income that naturally costs a dramatic lot to avoid them turning into murderers and whatever, something that the state up to this point had not quite had the possibility of controlling, at least to the degree we see now, right? And the medieval armies were, generally speaking, importantly disciplined, right? That this is a topic that goes beyond today's video regarding the 15th century, but the idea that, I don't know, ancient or modern armies were necessarily more orderly than medieval ones is not necessarily true. I mean, in a general sense, yes. I mean, a more standardized discipline in some contexts, not all of them, was something. But to say there is not like something inherently medieval that cannot be fundamentally measured. That you can measure as much as, here there's some greater reason for which these troops had to be unregulated or indisciplined, whatever, right? That there is a linear, say, at least something you can trace as a gradual transformation that is imperceptible even to people of these times, right? Again, less people to consider this, less people to satisfy. So a smaller but yet more compact state that in more advanced state, it can provide thus more resources in relative terms for, generally speaking, less but better armed, equipped, and disciplined troops. It's not a bad thing, right? In the late Middle Ages, you see the commands inflicting harsher penalties against all those that broke, for example, the order of battle, that came out of the ranks for any reason. But this is not just about the late Middle Ages. We find 12th century documents, 13th century documents, hell, even much older ones that say you have to stay disciplined, you don't have to loot, you don't have to do this and that, and if you do so, I'll cut a feet of yours or I will hang you. So this was naturally mostly done for the sake of the army order. I mean, it wasn't even because of the actual damage that it could cause locally. It was about maintaining an army that ready for any attack. If the army is just billeted, scattered everywhere, and the enemy attacks because people do not arrive in time to the army. I mean, this thing went on, still goes on, right? And it's always been an important concern of any commander, right? That is very dangerous for everyone involved. And what you may appreciate here is rather that the decline of universal powers and the emergence of some kind of national monarchies on a more compact regional level brought naturally the sense of kind of proto-national identity to emerge, to the point of saying, well, if you are fighting a war like with England as a French during the 100 Years' War, naturally you can't quite say that there is a French nation in absolute homogeneously speaking in France, but generally speaking, tendentially, the sense that France is fighting against England is there, right? The Normans are not affectionated to the English as much as they had been before. Certain areas of France now understand they're just under the Valois. And even though you have this dramatic defeats and even political disintegration at some point of the country, this sense of French identity prevails, and the war is won by the Valois as well, in part because of this. It's the people that matter. You don't want, again, your own troops to be looting the lands of your own subjects, as it often happened in other points. You want to maintain really a tighter order, and this requires the support of a more narrowly local base that you have thus to cultivate, also in as much as making them understand that it's everybody's their own interest to pay for those troops. as well, so that the country can be more stable, and the enemy chevauchee will not hit locally. And there is a great cooperation. I made a video about late medieval French military organization, and it deals with these aspects that naturally developed, especially in the time of crisis when France, after many centuries, was reinvaded in an horrendous way, whereas before part of the resistance also to the central government had been based on the fact that after all there was not much of a risk of that kind of invasion, right? You have to consider these aspects. Roberto Belsac said, for example, that it was important to, for example, distribute the loot more homogeneously, so that in the army, or equally more evenly, so that it wouldn't become much a matter of personal enterprise. So this was also a way to discipline the nobility that still had consistent private forces that could want to, let's say, to prevail in this kind of disputes, and still joining, I don't know, the royal army, but behaving a bit as they wanted, and creating problem in the army, wanting part of it to fight maybe against one another, as it did happen often, and and maybe to loot if they didn't receive any of that, and killing each other. This could be really an issue. There were a lot of brawls, assassinations in the same camps, and the enemy could take advantage of that, and or they simply, some part of the army could, with lots of also international mercenaries, could defect to the enemy, as it happened often, because you often have also the rise. I made a video about late medieval and early modern mercenarism, in which you realize that Europe is becoming ever more globalized internally. Like, you have more homogeneous event. You have Europeans that are ever more kind of intertwined. There are mercenaries from everywhere. Naturally, literally, the regional differences in warfare now at this point are flattened. All Europeans fight in the same identical way, much more than we also think by some kind of other indicators, like, I don't know, thinking that the longbow was just an English thing. It wasn't, as a matter of fact. And in any case, you could find English mercenaries around Europe anyway, so that tells you the degree by which this shared enterprise of war worked like. So it's a particularly dynamic time, after all, which naturally, after the crisis, sees some mercenary bands taking matters in their own hands, and this is why the local polities have to become tougher, right, and be enabled, as they generally did, to get rid of these bands, right, and or just to weaponize them against one another, and not really seeing here now new coups by mercenaries that become the future rulers of some places, like it could happen, I don't know, in Norman times, for example. So this is, after all, an important civilizational accomplishment, because what you realize is that medieval civilization survived its own crisis as a medieval world. We call it the Renaissance, but technically speaking, it's still medieval civilization, and you can't quite equivocate that. There is a continuous compaction of power, at least. We can't even say that the Middle Ages hadn't understood, like, you see, that attitude I was telling you before about the man-at-arms, that feels like more like an athlete, let's say, like, think about Boucicaut, that made stunts in full plate armor and so on. There are lots of adventurers. Tournaments become also a much more institutionalized thing. There are warriors that literally make a living out of that, etc. But at least the leaders start becoming truly more responsible about their own role during battle. Right? Naturally, you find plenty of engagements where even kings get killed on the battlefield and similar things, because it was still required until very late in time for a king to be able to fight. Until the 17th century, that there was at least an idea that was the part of the normal duty of a regnant. However, while of course in early modern times we have the true change, let's say the most significant one, still from medieval times and also previously, you had plenty of cases where the chiefs had realized the importance of just leading from the rear at some point, because just even as commanders they needed to give the order at the right moment, how to alternate the battle lines in combat, when to send reserves, and this thing had already become apparent now for quite some time. The 13th to 14th century have really famous examples of this, even though they're not very popularized, but you really find them. Allegedly was, I don't know, the same Rudolf of Habsburg that at the Battle of Markfeld gave the signal for the concealed reserve to attack the Bohemian army from the flank. In 1315 at Montecatini was the Ghibelline commander Uguccione della Faggiola Vu led the peasant army to victory by leading from the last battle line of Tree, which was talking about 30,000 men, the entire army, and de facto collecting the victory from the field after having carried out some incredibly advanced tactics, including feint flights, kind of flank attacks likely, and a concerted use of especially crossbow fire with together with the byline. I mean, he here you see actually the obvious necessity that in order to carry out such complex maneuvers you have to supervise the entire thing, right? To be at least temporarily away from combat, from one side just for saving yourself in case of necessity, because very often these leaders' death would have caused a major political crisis that nobody wanted, right? And of course these men could be captured, right? Think about, I don't know, John II, King of France at the Battle of Poitiers, that we made a video on last autumn. And that literally brought to the Jacquerie, because France didn't have money to, at least they had money, but they had to extract it somehow to pay the ransom, a huge ransom, and France entered a spiral of crisis. It led to much more consistent military reforms afterwards, so really changing history in many ways. Medieval leaders had always had a retinue that functioned as a sort of bodyguard on the battlefield. I mean, any general had always had that, right? However, this began to be also more advanced in terms of decision making, a sort of chief of sort of staff, right? That would help the chief to take decisions, taking all the useful measures, right? To also to defend himself on the battlefield. There is still Balzac in La Nef de Prince de Bataille de Noblesse says that the so-called prince or chief of war, the day of battle, has to have around him a good number of the best people that exist, and of men among the most competent of military things to advise them, keeping him, kind of preserving him, simply advising him, right? There could be some kind of inexperienced sovereign that needed the advice of a grizzled veteran. And as we've seen also, these various battle lines were commanded by very important individuals whose character, experience, and rank, let's say, was quite important, even just in terms of what kind of decision they would take. As we've seen, after Poitiers, the French had understood the necessity not to expose the king when this was present. A text recommends him that that he has to stay on horseback even when the entire army is on foot, because he has to literally, quote, still the same source, see his men fighting, and in case of necessity, just hurrying up to the place to comfort them and kind of spirit them, so that if it happens that everything is lost, at least the leader can put himself into safety, because it's better to lose a battle than the king, right? In fact, the loss of the king can cause the destruction of the kingdom, and this was quite obvious given that it had almost literally happened there. And the same author advises Isabel of Bavaria, saying further, Item, the king doesn't ever to have to go to battle, but to keep himself in a safe place, well guarded, because the capture that of the king, of a king of France, means to lose or to put in terrible desolation the reign, as the capture of King John showed. So practical example, and again, this thing of even trying to go, it was frequent in medieval battles by a degree to have a sort of pack of suicidal knights with the task properly of getting into the enemy commander's bodyguard and killing him, right? And very often they were cut to pieces even before they could approach him. But it did happen that they were successful in killing him or wounding him. And you have, I don't know, at the Battle of Bouvines, you find that was a bit of a different... No, that happened as well, but you have at some point the King of France that is literally pulled with a sort of harpoon by the Anglo-Germans and from one side, and the French that were pulling him from the other. So quite brutal situations and moments of chaos in which the sovereign could be lost in the melee. You didn't know. Or the aforementioned Rudolf of Habsburg at the Battle of Markfeld fell into the Weidenbach stream, and he was run over by his own cavalry, and he miraculously survived. He was saved by a Swiss ministerialis. And on the same occasion, the King Ottokar II of Bohemia instead stood his ground and died on the battlefield, probably after he had been captured, but still, right? So you have these instances of course, bodyguards having, just by profession, to die, right, instead of what they are defending. This was the ancestral primitive warlike ideal that no warifying, also in Tacitus, where the comitatus warriors cannot afford to be less than their commander. Also because in that case, there is a very poor social stratification, which means that if a warrior is better than the leader, and the leader is threatened because the warrior is going to become the next leader. So all these things naturally were still, by a different degree, but within the same spectrum, quite developed still in this time. So you realize that by the 15th century there is an important rationalization, which often happens after moments of crisis, because it's important to boost kind of the objectivity, right, in moments of crisis, about the fact that, again, that the King of France in 1356 had been captured. They had to pay the consequences of it. So there is literally a mindset modification by some sort that affects the same way also everybody is fighting in many ways. Definitely 15th century warfare was not primitive, right? Today we don't have the time to talk about the broader art of war, various examples. We will make other videos in which we'll talk about, for example, the cooperation of the various arms, which ones developed over this time. As we've seen, there is a much greater increase in the typology of troopers, at least by some more formal, specialized fashion, right, and than before. again, the man-at-arm is becoming ever more a man-at-arm. It's becoming heavier, less agile, right? And therefore you need some kind of lighter troops. Before, I don't know, in the 11th century you had the miles. That was it. Was kind of a heavier trooper for his time, with a coat of mail, helmet, shield, lance, whatever. And at best he had a squire that was sometimes not even armored at that time, that had just to wait and maybe pull out the master from the melee if he was wounded, or shouting to him, look right, look left, like a modern tank, commander. And this is, of course, a very refined and system also in previous times, but now it's going to be developed in a much bulkier, heavier, costly army that requires, as a consequence, also much greater strict discipline, right? Some people look at, I don't know, the Burgundian army, the failure during the wars against the Swiss, and say, oh, well, look, they were hyper developed, specialized, whatever. But I made a video about the battle plans of Charles the Bold at the Battle of, it was not one of the Swiss ones, if I'm not wrong, but in there, for example, you see it was I have made a video about that, so if you actually check the medieval Burgundy playlist, you will find it. But it's not important now. I just wanted to point out that the degree of battle plans that occurred, for example, in the Burgundian staff on that occasion, shows us much more complex battle plans that eventually were never used by the Burgundians. So that sometimes we say, oh my god, this was hyper sophisticated, they were trying to make things too complicated to interact with so many things at a time, but they wouldn't. The Burgundian armies functioned pretty much like any other army at the time. Actually, they were actually more advanced, more kind of better equipped, better drilled. There was a greater attention to the interaction of our arms virtuously, right? Just the Swiss went with an extra grip, something completely different, that was not just gradually improving the quality of the various parts of the system, was just surpassing the system, even with something more, frankly, more primitive, more really simpler, but that required a specific drive, a specific background that only the Swiss at that moment in history had, and that in any case would be surpassed after a few generations already by the major powers in Europe, with something even more advanced and dynamic. Right at Cerignola, Gonzalo de Cordoba, Grand Capitan, created literally modern warfare, so that the Swiss maybe began the Renaissance, but modern warfare and combined arms tactics against French cavalry, pike and shot, etc., was invented at Cerignola. Again, never underestimate the difficulties, the capacities, the competence was needed to make the systems work, right? It was not a delusional attempt or a failure or something that, just was entrusted to random chance, just per se, or carelessness, let's say better. It was actually, there was always a very strong unity of command, considering the background of these cultures. The entire world also was, at this point, more or less at the same level, so we don't have time to analyze that, but let's say medieval armies were banally, very notoriously, very, very cautious about their movements, very well informed. They used light cavalry, explorers, the scolted as they were called sometimes, to observe the enemy army, but also the ones of your own troops, right? Properly paving the way, having also to gather supplies along the way, knowing how to, how difficult a passage was, and testing it in advance, also tactically, right? And there are extraordinary feats of engineering carried out like this, like entire rivers, shifted from their previous beds to, fill to surround a certain place, or to or to deprive it of water, for example. The mechanisms here, also the properly the castles, the fortifications, we'll see it in another video, but they are, as you know, ever more effective. I made a video on the Traces Italiennes, which would open until the second half of the 17th century to modern military engineering, until Vauban, in fact. So there is a very advanced reflection of the art of war, and of course denying the existence of an art of war. There are people who did that, right? Some of the earliest scholars that approached the topic scientifically, like from the 19th century, began to say, "Oh, but the Middle Ages were disorderly, were bad. It was not an art of war. They sucked." But this is not true, absolutely, and we'll talk about it better in another video. But you know, they've made so many battle videos and tactics videos that, you know, there is no doubt, frankly, about the dramatic homogeneity, by the way, in the qualitative level of armies, right? I studied, I don't know how many battles in armies in my research, but just more broadly whatever I see here, and like you never meet like with an army that says, you know, this army sucked because they didn't know how to fight, or they didn't know how to perform tactics. Normally this thing does not exist in reality, right? This is not a, like, you could catch somebody, you know, with a low guard, you could surprise an enemy, things like this. But it's like in terms of military effectiveness, the average army was pretty high, constantly among every people, for their capacities, by the way, that they tended to be always to that. Also because warfare was so frequent that it would be just automatic by osmosis for this thing to happen, right? Everybody knew more or less what kind of deal warfare was, right? And thinking that the medieval art of war was somehow primitive or simple or backwards is just a fault in information, in other words, ignorance, rather than any historical factual reality. But people still believe that. I still find, for example, YouTube videos, say thumbnails that say, why were medieval armies so small? Speak for yourself. What the hell does it mean, right? First of all, it's not true that medieval armies were particularly small. It's not true that medieval armies were that pitched battles were particularly rare in the Middle Ages. What kind of numbers are you using? Because you see, I know that there aren't studies specifically on this, right? You find, at best, you have studies that say, oh, look, this battle, there were this number, and this here, this other, and then, yeah, okay, but you have an idea of the entire battles that were being fought in a given region, say in half a century, making the actual stats, because those studies do not exist, and I know that they don't. Also because I was the first one to make one about that, and people said, oh, but how can you do that? Well, because nobody did it, first of all, and because I read any damn source on that kind of regional context on theater in that 50 years, and I listed them all, and I made an important comparison between them all, and it's all very clear, reliable. Medieval sources are extremely reliable, by the way. They tend to be, and the statistical recognition there, all with independent sources, proves it, confirms it even more strongly than the basic one-to-one comparison. So I don't understand really how people still think that we can't be at this point with the study of medieval history. Like, we should be in a much more advanced place already, and as I said at the beginning of the video, there is hardly any of this in sight, right? Maybe I'm wrong, maybe there are people who are interested in this stuff. After all, I'm interested as well. I see people writing about it, but let's say quite these aspects with this method that I developed all by myself, frankly, I've never found yet, and there doesn't seem to be much of an interest either about the same. So I think that we should be much more attentive to this stuff. I know sometimes I sound boring as far as my criticism and judgment about how people don't study and they're bad, and this category is bad or whatever. Yeah, but I do it from a personal experience. That is to say, I have tested this stuff. Like I've been in those places, I've talked to those people, I've read what is put out, and that's the situation. Like, I'm not lying to you. I would lie to you if I told you the contrary. I can at best be wrong about the degree of this, but not to the point that you can flip it and say, well, no, actually we're doing a good job. At least, especially the non-professional environments are definitely, they shouldn't even be taken in consideration, in my opinion. Right? That's the impression that I received. I really don't feel like I should be making to pat on the shoulders of people that just pretend things to be normal in their own environments just because they have to live out of them. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not going to flatter them. I'm going to tell things as they are, as I saw them. Then if you prove me wrong with an exception, I will tell you. I didn't find just bad things, but when bad things are prevalent, you can try to be nice as much as you like, but if you really care about the issue, you're not going to make a favor to anyone, including yourself, in lying or turning a blind eye, let's say, to the matter, right? All right, naturally, we will talk again about 15th century warfare because, as I was saying before, the main problem, I would say, that we still haven't addressed with this century is an adequate comparative capacity. That is to say, like, for example, I don't think that there are people, but there aren't, actually, I'm sure about this, for quite precise reasons, that there aren't people that who, for example, have ever studied all the battles of the 100 Years' War. Right, when I was interested about the 100 Years' War in the past, because I never even began to study it, and I was curious, I realized, like, nobody can have covered all the sources of all the battles of the 100 Years' War, because we're not talking about just 3 or 4 battles. Here we're talking about tens, actually hundreds of engagements, at least the ones that you may want to note, and that you must have studied for a lifetime comparatively, for which, I don't know, even writing a thesis on Crécy is enormous. It's an enormous work. It's not, let's say, just, again, I do it in 1 day or 2 days, right? You can write an article on the internet about that, but studying a battle, reconstructing it, and having an objective assessment of what happened, and don't think that we actually even know about the major battles of the 100 Years' War, exactly how things unfolded, because it's not clear. Don't think that we have that certainty, nor that we can have it. It's not that somebody doesn't do it their own work, it's literally that we don't know. And we likely never know, because most of the sources have been disclosed now. And it's rare just to have significant information regarding to certain aspects in the first place. And not only this, but if you don't have anyone who has ever studied the 100 Years' War altogether, how can you have a reliable assessment of the 100 Years' War from that point of view? Yes, you can write, I don't know, like ospreys that tell you, the 100 Years' War was like this, like that. There is even an interesting level of information that sums up the thing, but again, dimensionally, do you know exactly what all the fate? You must feel that. You must follow the history. You must study for decades in order to even just have a consistent idea of what the 100 Years of War was. So how can you have it also in the entire medieval European warfare in general? Naturally, the advice is to start studying as much as you can, but preferably also having a lot of awareness about these limits, and about the fact that if you really care about this all, you should be the best way to give a dimension hierarchically is to start studying a bit of everything, right? If you go in my medieval warfare playlist, you will find how many battles I covered from different times and places. If you don't do that, you can't compare, you can't evaluate something because you don't have a term of comparison. Like when you reconstruct a battle for the first time seriously with all the sources available, I did it for my master thesis back in the day, you think the world in a way, then you reconstruct a second battle and that world changes, and then the third one changes, and the interesting thing is that it doesn't mess the whole thing up. It actually increases the accuracy of your evaluation, so that you can compare those battles more accurately because you know them together, not because you know just very well one. And instead, most people, most researchers, most scholars today are exclusively about this. You just know very well one thing, and consequently, you don't actually know it well because you can't dimension it on the base of the others. So start from the entire panorama. If you want to know the 15th century well, study the Wars of the Roses, study the 100 Years' War, study the Reconquista, study the German warfare, study the Italian condottieri, study the Hussites, study the Ottomans, right? Study the Poles, etc. Like, you must make this effort to identify accurately what was the main deal at the time. Not one battle, not that little notion that you can spend with your friends and that you factually do not know shit about the art of war. Again, the structural knowledge of the development, the transformation of armament, tactics, strategies, and more. You can know it just in general. Again, with disclosure books, 200 pages, you read 4 or 5 of them, and on the late Middle Ages, maybe you learned something, but it's not going to be enough. It's not going to give you the dimensional objectivity that it takes to express an accurate judgment about that topic. And that's why I'm so pissed, generally speaking, with the things I started the video from, because it's those ones that set poor standards. It's those ones that just flash you with what you may have been titillated by over time just because you saw cool graphic, cool pictures about, and you think, about the aesthetics of medievalism, and at the end of the day you don't factually know anything about the Middle Ages. There is a wholly different world, right? There is a transcendental dimension in how mankind behaves that you must have the courage to assess first on you, right? And then to understand the world around you, because otherwise there's no room for that. And studying the 15th century, I think, is quite fascinating. As I said before, I always stayed out of it because I'm a 14th century, early 14th century, late 13th century kind of historian, right? And albeit I got pretty hardcore in depth in that period's warfare, I still haven't stepped in the equivalent way in any other. So I mostly observe what I see, and I realize that even those who normally do not care about these topics that much methodologically to even be aware of certain things. But I do confess that the 15th century is very fascinating. It's a subjective bias of mine, but I always seen the 15th century as a bit darker, kind of more sort of more secularized and rationalized, modernized reality that I didn't quite appreciate, even properly, in the decline of the universal powers, the papacy, the empire, etc. But obviously it's beautiful, right? Studying certain battles, as we've seen. I can't actually look at my own 15th century playlist because some of you surely noticed that, but I started creating some, excuse me, typing 15th century. Alright, that's my own playlist. These playlists based on just on the century. Made 32 videos about that. I think there is more than double about the 13th century. It's one of, if not my favorite century. And we haven't made so much. We made the Battle of Formigny. Just looking at the battles. The Battle of Maleshov, this is a Hussite one. Formigny is 100 years war before the Battle of Chatillon, of Castillon, actually. The Battle of Tewkesbury, this was from the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of Toro, this is interesting, also from the Iberian Peninsula. Made something about tactics here, the old Swiss Confederate Army, etc. The Battle of Torviol, this was between Skanderbeg and the Ottomans. The Battle of Molinella, Ricardina, that I was telling you before. So even if you start from these, for example, I think you can get a much better, more concrete picture of the war. Because the interesting thing, telling the truth about warfare, is that the more you study it, and the more you realize how homogeneous it really is. Right? That's something we tend to lack as a general understanding. That again, while you think at the 100 Years' War without background, you tend to say or to think that the 100 Years' War point, right? So this is my universe, and the rest maybe it's so different because you don't know about the rest. When you study all these battles, even just these few battles I listed here, you realize how dramatically, similar the entire warfare was. It doesn't take a genius to realize it. We know that by the 15th century, I mean, if you have a minimal military historical education, you know that more or less, at least in Europe, Eurasia, people fought in a pretty similar way, even more in Europe. Again, in Europe, it's all dramatically homogeneous by now. From quite some century, by the way. But you must see it in depth before, getting to it, right? So the aspect here to me is quite fascinating, just as a test, as an experiment. And the more I learn about the 15th century, the more I discover stuff, because that's also the beauty of history, that it literally never ends, right? That can be like, you can navigate yourself into it, and you're never going to be disappointed, never, right? That's actually pretty powerful and important in the general picture. All right. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, I thank you as always heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.